There's one moment in military history that says more about the gap between American air power and Iran's aging fleet than almost anything else. But it didn't happen during the conflict in the Middle East that started in 2023. No, this happened a decade earlier in 2013 over the international waters of the Persian Gulf. And not only did the entire exchange, which pitted an aging American fighter jet flown by Iran against one of the most advanced US fighters of its time, last only a few minutes, but it also ended without a single shot being fired. So, what made it so unbelievable? You're about to find out. Now, to fully understand what made the encounter so exceptional and what it reveals about Iran's military situation today, we need to go back even further than the incident itself, to the history of how Iran ended up flying decades-old American jets against its more modern counterparts. It's ultimately a tale of global geopolitics and the uncomfortable situation Iran has been in for the past few decades. But let's start with the incident. It was March 2013. An American MQ-1 Predator drone was conducting a surveillance and reconnaissance mission roughly 16 miles off the coast of Iran in international airspace. The Predator is not a fighter aircraft by any means. It's a long, slender, propeller-driven platform designed for observation, surveillance, and possibly deploying a single targeted strike. While classified as an unmanned aerial combat vehicle, its actual combat capabilities are long-range missile deployment with air-to-air missiles, not dogfighting. Furthermore, a drone can't outrun a plane, considering its top speed is around 135 miles per hour, but it sees a lot, and that made it a target. Now, after spotting the drone, Iran's Air Force scrambled two F-4 Phantom jets to intercept it. The Phantom is a twin-engined supersonic aircraft with a distinctive shark-like profile and a history stretching back to the late 1950s. In its day, it was a workhorse of American air power through the Vietnam era and a jet that Iran had received in large numbers from the United States before everything changed in 1979. In 2013, those same airframes, now approaching 50 years old, were among the best Iran had in its fleet. Technically, the country still had 40 or so F-14s, which were a generation newer and better air superiority fighters. But among the two, the F-4 is considered more agile. There's also a possibility Iran considered using the older aircraft as a way to minimize risk and wear on newer and more capable planes, especially since the threat was just a drone. So, two of them climbed out toward the Predator, one hanging back while the other moved in for the intercept. What neither Iranian pilot knew was that there was already another pilot up there. Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Sutterfield, callsign Showtime, was flying an F-22 Raptor nearby, assigned to escort the Predator as part of a policy the US Air Force had quietly adopted after an earlier incident in 2012, when a pair of Iranian Su-25 ground attack jets opened fire on a drone in international airspace. Since then, the Americans have stopped sending drones through the Gulf alone anymore. Sometimes the escort was a pair of FA-18 Super Hornets off a nearby carrier. On this particular day, it was an F-22. The F-22 is the product of a program that began in the 1980s, when American defense planners were starting to get worried about the Soviet aircraft programs and needed a superior fighter to answer them. The result was the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, which eventually produced the Raptor and started its service in 2005. Even now, it remains, by most credible measures, the finest air superiority fighter ever built. It's shaped from the outset to be invisible. Every angle, every surface, every internal cavity is engineered to scatter radar returns away from enemy receivers. Its twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines produce enough thrust to push it through the sound barrier without afterburner, which is a capability called supercruise that allows it to sustain high-speed flight without the enormous fuel burn and infrared signature that afterburner creates. It carries its weapons internally, behind flush-fitting bay doors that open for fractions of a second during an engagement and close again, maintaining the aircraft's stealth profile throughout. And its avionics were designed to have a sensor fusion and electronic warfare suite to give its pilot a picture of the battlefield that other aircraft simply can't match. While the F-4s did receive some modernization measures, the last imports from the US happened in the early 1970s, 40 years before the incident. And yes, Iran continued using Chinese, Russian, or even domestic designs to retrofit the aging F-4E platform. But the fact is that the F-4 is still a third-generation fighter aircraft, while the F-22 belongs to the fifth generation. As Showtime watched the lead F-4 close on the Predator, he waited. Then, running on the confidence that his jet was practically invisible to the Iranian radar, he did something extraordinary. He pushed his Raptor beneath the F-4, close enough to see it clearly, and even more importantly, close enough to make out the weapon stations and assess what the Iranian pilot was carrying. The Iranian pilot had absolutely no idea this was happening. The Raptor's stealth systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do. Showtime inspected the weapons load, pulled back, and made his move. He banked left, climbed, then eased his jet up alongside the F-4 and showed up on the Iranian's pilot's peripheral vision, seemingly out of nowhere. We can only imagine the shock of that moment for the Iranian pilot, calmly sitting in your cockpit and suddenly finding a machine that was supposed to be invisible right there beside you. And then Showtime really turned all of that into a show. He keyed his radio, contacted the Iranian pilot, and spoke some chilling words. "You really ought to go home." Which they did. Both F-4s simply turned and left, without an engagement or any type of escalation. The entire mission turned into a relatively quiet demonstration of what fifth-generation air power looks like when it operates against a legacy fleet. Now, to understand why that gap is so vast, and why Iran remains dependent on aircraft that were already aging by the time Showtime was learning to fly, we have to examine both machines in detail and then trace the longer history of how Iran ended up in this position. The F-4 Phantom II first flew in 1958. It was designed by the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, later known as McDonnell Douglas for the United States Navy, initially as a fleet defense interceptor, and it grew into one of the most versatile and widely used jets of the Cold War era. By the time of the Vietnam War, both the Navy and Air Force were flying it for everything from air superiority demonstrations to ground attack to reconnaissance. It was capable of Mach 2.23 at altitude, making it one of the fastest aircraft available at the time. But perhaps more importantly, it was powerful. It had few limitations that could be exposed in actual combat. Early versions had no internal gun, reflecting a doctrine that turned out to be dangerously optimistic about the reliability of air-to-air missiles. The gun was added later. But for a few years, it was one of the weakest dogfighting aircraft precisely because it relied on missiles. Additionally, the jet required extensive maintenance, and its radar, while advanced for its time, was a large mechanically scanned dish that produced a significant radar cross-section and was prone to interference and jamming. While this ultimately made the aircraft feared, by the 1970s, the Phantom was already beginning to be superseded in American service by more specialized platforms. The F-15 Eagle took over the air superiority role in 1976. The F-16 Fighting Falcon arrived for multi-role work in 1978. The Phantom was gradually retired from frontline American service, eventually phased out entirely by the mid-1990s. Today, the US Air Force mainly flies F-22s and F-35s, while older aircraft like the F-15 and F-16s still see some use due to their lower overall costs and not wanting to use a new device for a cursory mission. The F-4's only place on US soil is in museums. But in Iran, those same jets are still operational, at least on paper, because Iran has had no way to replace them. The F-22 Raptor, by comparison, constitutes 60 years of aviation engineering advancement. Its radar cross-section is estimated to be roughly equivalent to a steel marble, a tiny fraction of what even a modern fourth-generation fighter presents to enemy radar, an almost incomprehensible reduction compared to the Phantom. Its sensor fusion integrates information from its own radar, its passive infrared sensors, and data-linked inputs from other aircraft and ground stations. This presents the pilot with a synthesized, unified picture rather than raw feeds from separate systems. The plane's targeting system can track multiple targets simultaneously, engage at long range with AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles fired from internal bays, and do all of this while remaining functionally invisible to opposing aircraft. In a beyond visual range engagement, an Iranian F-4 pilot might never even know an F-22 was in the same airspace until a missile was already in the air. And even in close quarters, the Raptor is equally dominant. Its thrust vectoring nozzles allow it to redirect its engine exhaust to control the aircraft's orientation, independent of airspeed, giving it significant maneuverability at low speeds. If an F-4 engaged an F-22 in a close quarters turning fight, it would be immediately spun out by the F-22's more aggressive movement. But of course, it would also never get to that fight without being detected first. But why is Iran actually still flying the F-4s? Well, basically, because they and the US stopped being friends. Before 1979, Iran actually had a rather positive relationship with the United States, which extended to military equipment trades. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was a close American ally throughout the Cold War, and successive US administrations saw a strong Iranian military as a stabilizing force in a region that was almost constantly on the brink of an all-out war. So American weapons flowed into Iran in enormous quantities, including tanks, helicopters, naval vessels, and aircraft. As a result, the Iranian Imperial Air Force was, by regional standards, extraordinarily well equipped. At its peak, Iran operated over 200 F-4 Phantoms in multiple variants, along with F-5 Tiger-like fighters, and had actually placed orders for the then cutting-edge F-14 Tomcat, which was the swing-wing naval interceptor that would later become famous through Top Gun. Approximately 80 F-14s were actually delivered before the revolution. Iran also received some spare parts, pipelines, and more critically, training. American instructors working alongside Iranian pilots, teaching tactics and maintenance at a level that few other countries in the region could match. Then, the Islamic Revolution happened. In 1979, Shah Pahlavi was overthrown. The American embassy was seized, and 52 diplomats were held hostage for 444 days. The relationship between Washington and Tehran collapsed overnight, and the arms pipeline stopped. Soon after, the spare parts dried up, and with American advisors leaving at the start of the revolution, the Iranian Air Force was left with one of the most modern fleets in the Middle East, and absolutely no way to sustain it. The timing couldn't have been worse for Iran. Within a year, Iraq invaded. The Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, was a grinding, catastrophic conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. The Iranian Air Force fought hard during that war, with the F-14s and F-4s performing better than many expected, given the supply crisis, but the toll on the fleet was severe. Aircraft were lost in combat, and others were cannibalized for parts to keep the survivors flying. By the end of the war, a fleet that had numbered in the hundreds was a fraction of its former self, and every aircraft that remained was now years older and harder to maintain. The obvious question then is, why couldn't Iran simply replace these aircraft? It's been more than 4 decades since the revolution. You might think that in all that time, Iran could have sourced modern jets from somewhere, such as Russia or China. The answer is more complicated than it might appear, and it cuts to the heart of Iran's actual military situation. But before we get into this, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show. We provide detailed analytics on historical events, as well as track the newest developments in global geopolitics. Now, to answer the question of how Iran got stuck with obsolete F-4s, let's start with Russia, as it's often cited as Iran's patron and a counterweight to American influence in the region. And there is some truth to that, as Russia has sold Iran surface-to-air missile systems, including the S-300, which significantly upgraded Iran's ground-based air defenses. Russian and Iranian interests have also aligned in Syria to oppose the Western order surrounding Israel. But the relationship has critical limits that are often glossed over. Russia has been remarkably reluctant to sell Iran modern combat aircraft. The reasons are strategic. Moscow has its own regional interests to balance. After 1990, Israel was a major buyer of Russian natural gas, the trend which only ended after sanctions in 2022. It meant it could have significant leverage in Moscow. Arming Iran with modern fighters would create serious complications with Israel, with the Gulf states, and with Russia's broader diplomatic positioning. The S-300 sale itself was delayed for years by exactly this kind of pressure, and combat jets like the MiG-29s or Su-30s would genuinely modernize Iranian air power and thus indirectly create more pressure on Israel. Russia also needs to basically tiptoe around the Western powers in the region too. If the US and its allies believe Russia is overstepping its bounds in the Middle East, it could have been hit with even more sanctions. Of course, this all became moot by 2014, but the sentiment held before that. In 2022, Russia agreed in principle to supply Su-35 fighters to Iran, but as of 2025, no confirmed deliveries of operational aircraft had occurred. Some leaked documents suggested that Russia was building up to 16 aircraft slated for delivery between 2025 and 2027, and which were paid for. But circumstances of the Ukraine war have made Russian military exports to anyone else significantly more complicated. China has similarly supplied limited quantities of relatively outdated systems. Iran has attempted to develop its own aircraft domestically. The Hisa Kosar, a light fighter claimed to be derived from the American F-5, has been publicized with significant fanfare. Independent assessments suggest it offers little beyond what the original F-5 provided. Iran has also tried to upgrade its existing F-14s and F-4s with locally sourced components and modifications, but the fundamental airframes are still the same ones delivered before 1979. Whatever the modifications, you can't really update the aerodynamics, the radar cross-section, or the core systems architecture of a 1960s designed jet without essentially building a new aircraft. The result is an air force that still lists F-4 Phantoms, F-14 Tomcats, F-5 Tigers, MiG-29s, and Chinese supplies F-7s among its inventory, but in practice operates a fraction of those in anything resembling combat-ready condition. And while estimates of Iran's operational fighter fleet vary, credible defense analysts generally suggest the number of aircraft that could actually be sustained in high-tempo combat operations is far lower than what the country actually received before the revolution. Spare parts are scarce, and maintenance is difficult. In February 2026, an Iranian F-4 crashed during a routine training flight in the Hamadan province, killing one of the two crew members on board. This was an incident involving an F-4, still conducting training missions in 2026 and still crashing because the airframe is 50 years old and there's nothing to replace it with. But equipment is only part of the story. The other dimension, and arguably the more important one over the long run, is training. And here, the gap between the United States and Iran is just as stark. American fighter pilots undergo some of the most intensive and systematically refined training in the world. It begins with undergraduate pilot training, which is itself rigorous, and then continues through specialized weapons training courses that build on years of accumulated combat experience, debriefs, and doctrine development. The U.S. Air Force Fighter Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, colloquially known as Top Gun's Air Force equivalent, has been refining air combat tactics for decades, incorporating lessons from every engagement and every exercise into a continuously updated body of knowledge. American pilots regularly fly against adversary aircraft in realistic, dissimilar air combat training, meaning they fly their jets against aircraft and tactics that deliberately simulate what enemy pilots would do, so that when a real encounter happens, it isn't the first time they've seen those tactics. Crucially, the United States Air Force has flown the F-4 Phantom. Pilots have operated it, trained on it, and understand what's good and bad about the plane. Pilots who transition from Phantoms to Eagles and from Eagles to Raptors carry with them an intimate knowledge of how the F-4 handles, where its limitations are, and what a pilot in that cockpit can and can't do. When Showtime approached those Iranian F-4s in 2013, the American understanding of that aircraft went back generations. The tactics the Iranians were using, the performance envelope they were operating within, the constraints they faced, all of that was deeply familiar to the American side. The Iranians were flying an aircraft that the Americans had already figured out and surpassed decades ago. Iran's pilot training program, by contrast, has operated under severe constraints since 1979. The American advisors who built the original training infrastructure left after the revolution and never came back. The war with Iraq consumed experienced pilots and disrupted institutional continuity. International isolation has restricted access to the kind of large-scale, realistic joint exercises that keep air forces sharp. Iranian pilots are not flying against F-22s in training. They're not flying against F-35s. They're flying against each other in aging airframes with limited flight hours, preparing for a threat they've never actually encountered and have no realistic way to simulate. The encounter in 2013 illustrated all of this perfectly. The Iranian pilots had no idea the F-22 was there until Showtime chose to reveal himself. Their radar didn't see it. Their systems didn't detect it. Their training had not prepared them for an aircraft that could operate unseen in the middle of their formation and then materialize beside them. Then there's the psychological aspect of an aircraft appearing from nowhere, right next to you, on a platform that your best senses couldn't find. It would prompt immediate shock and retreat. And that's exactly what happened. The deeper point is that military power is not just dependent on who has the biggest budget or most political will. It's also a function of time, like the decades it took to build a coherent, sustained, institutionally healthy air force with modern aircraft, deep training pipelines, and the organizational memory that comes from continuous development and real operational experience. The US has maintained that continuity unbroken since the Second World War. The trajectory runs from the F-4 Phantom to the F-15 to the F-16 to the F-22 to the F-35, with each generation incorporating the lessons of the last. Iran had that trajectory interrupted overnight in 1979 and has never been able to rebuild it. The aircraft stopped, the training stopped, the supply chain stopped, and while time kept moving and aviation technology kept advancing in the rest of the world, Iran's Air Force was frozen at a particular moment. So the Iranians just went home that day, and not because they lacked courage, nor because they made a mistake. The gap between what they were flying and what was flying alongside them was simply too large to bridge in the air. You can't outmaneuver a generation, you can't outrun 50 years of aviation progress, and you certainly can't fight what you can't see. But if you want to check out how the US is dealing with Iran at present, make sure to watch the Military Show's latest videos. We cover daily events and breakthroughs in world warfare, geopolitics, and military engineering.